gathered here in the struggle and the power. Spirit, draw near. What a month September has been so far, just 10 days in. What struggle. Our country's dreamers betrayed, their lives placed in peril, with the Attorney General announcing the end of a program meant to protect them from deportation. They were brought here as children, raised as Americans. They are our children, and they are in danger of exile. And what power Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Jose right on its tail. Flooding in India, wildfires here at home, massive earthquake in Mexico, and then there's North Korea. I don't even think that's everything. I know that's not everything. Spirit, draw near. Indeed, we need an anchor. We need some direction. You know it's bad when the New York Times runs an article about end times. They did that on Friday, exploring the religious tendency to turn to sacred scriptures at times like this for some kind of concrete information to ground our understanding about what's happening. A prediction, as in, these are the exact signs of God's overall plan. Or an explanation, as in, this exact thing is happening because God is angry. But ancient scriptures have never been at their best when it comes to predicting historical events. That's why the image of a guy with a sign yelling about end times on a street corner has become, at this point, a caricature of religion. There's always been somebody doing that. And as for explanations, if we examine the present and the past, we see that bad and good things happen to pretty much everyone. I remember a little poem that was quoted in the book, The Interpretation of Cultures, by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. Rain falls on the just and the unjust fella, but the unjust has the just's umbrella. Rain falls on the just and the unjust fella, but the unjust has the just's umbrella. And so while the question of why is a natural and interesting one, in the Unitarian Universalist tradition, we tend not to dwell so much on why as on what now. What now? Meaning, how does our faith call us to respond? And how shall we be in this world, knowing what we know about it? The answers have to do with hope. There are a couple of kinds of hope. One kind of hope is a feeling that comes from the expectation that we either will or might get what we want. One time when my daughter was about 3 or 4 years old, she was playing in the backyard of our little home in Oregon, and she heard a song. I can still hear it now. It's one of those tunes that you cannot get out of your head very easily. It went... repeat. Eddie Murphy did a whole skit about this back in the 1980s in some tight red leather pants and a red leather jacket unzipped about to his navel, no shirt. He made comedy sexy back then, didn't he? Anybody remember Murphy's Ice Cream Man skit? Ice Cream Man! Whatever a kid was doing, they'd stop and they would fly into a full-blown panic for the Ice Cream Man, Eddie Murphy said. Well, I was in the kitchen with the window open, and in the backyard, I heard my tiny daughter start yelling like Eddie Murphy, "Ice cream!" And the thing that happened next was she propelled her 40-pound body right through the sliding screen door, flattening it. I mean, the whole frame came out of the track, and it landed on the dining room floor as she continued to make a straight shot for the front door. That is one kind of hope. Hope that you'll get what you want, or a situation will change as you'd like. This kind of hope tends to operate on short or at least measurable timelines. We hope to catch the ice cream truck. We hope a law protecting civil rights will be enacted. We hope for a cure. We hope to reach safer ground. This kind of hope can spur us into a targeted kind of action. Run through the screen, call our legislators, read medical studies, or get in the car. Prayers arising from this kind of hope are intercessory, as in, please let the good thing happen. This kind of hope is energizing. It's the carbohydrates of hope, gets you going. And we need that, especially when there's an act fast, life or death kind of situation like an ice cream truck. When the situation is not acute, though, there is one potential pitfall to this kind of hope, and that is if we get so focused on some future event, we forget to experience the present moment, this day that we've been given. There's always something to be grateful for right now, some bit of joy or some measure of love. We have to make sure that we are connected to the present, even as we are hopeful for the future. The other kind of thing about this kind of hope, is that it's a feeling, and feelings come and go. We don't always feel hopeful. Or sometimes we might have that kind of hope, but it's not enough to overcome the vast need and the suffering and the enormous problems that lie before us, some of which will surpass our lifetimes. It's like if you're departing base camp at the bottom of Mount Everest and all you've got is some crackers, some carbohydrates, and you're going, I'm going to need some oxygen, not to mention better nourishment, and you know you cannot make that kind of climb alone. Sound like I'm talking about church? No, I'm talking in church. This is what this is about. We're about life, about the difficult stuff, and about the kinds of hope. When the time-limited feeling kind of hope is not enough, that's when we need another kind of hope, a kind that transcends events and feelings that come and go, a kind of hope that cannot be taken away, one that's less a feeling and more an inner orientation and practice. It comes first from the knowledge that our lives matter. Your life is precious. It is sacred. It is worth protecting. In the Jewish and Christian scriptures, it is said that humans are made in the image of God. In the Unitarian Universalist evolution of those traditions, we say that you are born already holy. Listen, this week, I had an opportunity to sit down and talk with one of the people who has taken sanctuary in churches in Albuquerque to avoid deportation. Emma has lived in the U.S. for 25 years, and she's married to an American citizen. She has no criminal history. When she arrived to the U.S. from Honduras in the 1990s, she applied for asylum, but she never received a court date, and she went on with her life. In 2011, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, arrested her in her home, and they issued a deportation order. But at that time, a deportation order wasn't necessarily immediate, so she was released. And as long as she kept showing up at her regular appointments with immigration authorities to check in, it seemed they would allow her to stay and possibly find another solution to her immigration status. Then the Trump administration began prioritizing easy targets for deportation. And suddenly there were stories of people showing up at their appointments and being jailed and deported without warning. It happened to a woman in Arizona, the married mother of 2 American children, who was brought to the U.S. when she herself was only 14. Knowing this, Emma took refuge at the Friends Meeting House instead of going to her next appointment. That was about 5 months ago. She's still hoping her immigration status can be resolved. We discussed the uncertainty of Emma's situation. Perhaps it is somehow part of God's larger plan, she suggested. And Emma's story has indeed become part of a larger movement toward humane immigration reform. By taking sanctuary and speaking with the media, she has allowed her story to become visible and to be told in such a way that others may now become aware of just how senseless our immigration system is, and they'll call for change. But no matter what happens, no one can take away Emma's inherent worth and dignity. Am I right? The U.S. might reveal its ugliness in the way it treats her, but she will not be any less holy or precious. And because she's precious, what injustice she has suffered or will suffer only magnifies the shamefulness of this nation's policies and the scourge of racism that is increasing their meanness and violence. Emma's life and your life and my life are valuable, precious, and they are consequential. It matters what we do with our lives. We can use them to bless the world or to curse it, either with indifference or meanness. Either way, your life is part of something larger than you. It's bound up with other lives and with all the possibilities for love, healing, kindness, compassion, wisdom, and beauty. It's part of a larger story. And what will your role be in it? Will it reflect an inner orientation of hope? Will it be a story of practicing hope? Here's the thing. This kind of practiced hope that comes from an inner orientation requires doing what Sister Simone Campbell calls walking toward trouble. It asks us to be present with whatever is happening and to find ways to connect our precious lives with hope in action, and to connect with other people, too, for the greater good. Last week, I mentioned the work of Juana Bordas, who points out that the dominant culture of the U.S. is a very individualistic one, all about personal responsibility and personal morality, a lift yourself up by the bootstraps kind of an ethic. But you guys, it is physically impossible to lift yourself up by bootstraps. And this mindset blinds people to the ways that systems create insurmountable obstacles for some while rolling out the red carpet for others. It focuses on individual morality while ignoring the collective morality, or in this case, some collective immorality. What's needed now is an ethic of the common good, a collective ethic, an ethic for the good of the whole, such as we find in Latin American, African American, and Native American cultures. This is a time for a moral movement led by a diverse coalition of leaders. And there is a diverse new movement underway, a new movement with a name even longer than our denomination's name. It's the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The movement's co-chair and most visible spokesperson, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, visited Albuquerque last month. How many of you either went to the mass meeting or you tried to go? Lots of you. The crowd overflowed the church that hosted the event. I heard that there were about 1,200 people there. People sat in the aisles and they listened from the foyer, and there were people all the way out in the parking lot listening. The original Poor People's Campaign, many of you will know, had Martin Luther King Jr. as one of its leaders and spokespersons back in 1967 and 68. And back then, that campaign sought to address systemic racism, poverty, militarism, and economic issues. Today's campaign picks up those themes, and it links them with new ones, new old ones, really. Dr. Barber draws connections between healthcare, environmental protection, access to education, transgender equality, LGBTQ, women's rights, and voting rights. Can you believe we are still having to talk about equal voting rights in 2017? We are. We really are. And we have to because politicians have limited voting hours, increased ID requirements, and they've done redistricting precisely to weaken the voting power of people of color. In North Carolina, the U.S. Supreme Court said they did this with surgical precision. That's chilling and unconscionable. Now, it's often the case, though, that all these causes don't seem to automatically go together. You don't usually hear about environmentalism and LGBTQ issues going together, or racism and transgender. You don't hear that very much either, even though the Black Lives Matter movement does explicitly link them. Advocacy groups for these issues tend to work in isolation. But they have something in common. They're moral issues. They're issues relating to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and to the interdependent web of life of which we are a part, two of the 7 principles at the heart of this liberal faith. How Americans handle these issues will reflect how well we've grasped the golden rule taught by every major world religion, and likewise whether we have understood the world religious imperative to welcome the stranger. The religious right now is obsessed with controlling women and sex, apparently to the point of not noticing a record-breaking hurricane taking lives and causing mass destruction to the south, and not having much to say about a violent white supremacist rally to the east. Did you hear about the so-called Nashville Statement? It was put forth by the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, an organization founded, quote, to help the church defend against the accommodation of secular feminism. The organization explicitly argues that women should be submissive to men. On their website, in its section on the proper setup of households, it also cites the words of the Apostle Paul from the Gospels when he urged slaves to be obedient to their masters. Not kidding. You can go online and see it for yourself. The statement laid out the usual conservative Christian judgments about being gay or transgender. It argued that marriage should be between one man and one woman, and also basically said that no good Christian will agree to disagree about these things. If you don't impose this viewpoint on others, you are a sinner. The mayor of Nashville called it poorly named and said it does not reflect the city's values. And other groups have put out other kinds of statements in contrast to this one. But this one was signed by 150 prominent evangelical leaders, overwhelmingly men. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would venture to guess that there wasn't a lot of racial diversity in that group. Certainly the staff and the board of the council appear to be almost exclusively white men. I don't mean to diss either men or white people. It's just that when one powerful demographic tries to legislate morality for everybody else, it's going to be morally suspect sooner than it's going to be morally right. Case in point. In the Christian scriptures, Jesus says nothing at all about homosexuality or transgender. He does not tell women to obey men. But he is pretty clear about one thing, that he thinks divorce is wrong. He also seems to suggest that if a person gets divorced, the most ethical thing they can do afterward is remain celibate for the rest of their lives. That is exactly what the Nashville Statement wants gay people to do, but divorce does not appear in the Nashville Statement at all. Nor is it something evangelical leaders are trying to pass laws about. No one has taken a case all the way to the Supreme Court trying to prevent a baker from having to sell a wedding cake to someone on their second marriage. In fact, 80% of white evangelicals voted for a president who's on his third marriage. On the other hand, the Gospels and the rest of the Bible have a lot to say about poverty, welcoming the stranger, and helping the afflicted. The scriptures rail against economic oppression and greed. How did the religious right end up being the morality party when, to borrow the words of Reverend Dr. Barber, they say so much about what God says so little and so little about what God says so much? What passes for morality is not moral at all. It is time for a moral revival. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign is about. Albuquerque was the second stop on a 25-state tour. From each state, the campaign wants to train 1,000 people in nonviolent resistance. Next spring, there will be a highly publicized wave of civil disobedience spanning 25 states over 6 weeks. That should make an impact. The goal, according to the campaign's website, is to force a serious national examination of the enmeshed evils of systemic racism, poverty, militarism, and environmental devastation during a key election year, while strengthening and connecting informed and committed grassroots leadership in every state, increasing their power to continue this fight long after June 2018. If you want to get on board, you can go to their website and sign the pledge. I already did. It's just poorpeoplescampaign.org, or you can Google Poor People's Campaign and you'll find it pretty quick. Our denomination has also endorsed this campaign. When I came across Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise, again this week, I thought of Emma and the hope, power, and strength that come from deeply knowing that your life is precious and holy, body, mind, and spirit, and that it matters what you do with it. And I thought of the Poor People's Campaign and how we affirm that sacred truth for one another by standing with each other, building connections, empowering each other, listening, and speaking up for what is good, compassionate, and right. There's so many things we cannot control in this world, but there are also many things we can, and no one has to do it alone. There's so much to be hopeful for. I'm going to wrap up in just a second, but before I do, I'm going to lift up a couple of opportunities that are connected to these things I've been talking about. First, more volunteers are still needed to help with sanctuary, to accompany the people who have taken sanctuary in Albuquerque. That means training to learn what to do if ICE shows up, and working a training shift with an experienced volunteer, and then covering shifts at one of the 2 locations. Our First U group has been doing a great job. About 25 people have already been regularly volunteering. But we do need more help because, unfortunately, it does not look like sanctuary is going to end soon, and more people may end up taking sanctuary. So there's a table in the social hall where you can sign up after the service or get more information if you're interested in that. And we are hosting the next training for accompaniment in sanctuary, and that's going to be on September 22nd. We are also hosting an interfaith community organizing training next weekend. This is an Albuquerque interfaith event, and anybody is welcome to sign up for it. When you learn how to organize for collective action, you learn how to change our community and our country. Community organizing was a strategic foundation of many major successful movements in our nation's history, including civil rights, farm workers' rights, women's rights. So there's a table for that, too. Is that in the social hall, Dan? It might be. Or you can go online to the Albuquerque Interfaith site. Or contact Dan Lilly. The cost of the training is $25, and I think scholarships are still available. That is true. Okay. Finally, our church is also hosting a series of conversations called Community Conversations on Race with the mediator, restorative justice expert, and diversity trainer Tanya Covington. Those conversations are open to the wider community, and they're going to happen every Thursday for 6 weeks, starting September 21st. $10 is payable at the door. You can drop into any one of them. You don't have to attend all of them. And so if you've been needing a place to bring your questions or concerns or swirling thoughts pertaining to race in these times, this is a great place to come for connecting and learning. Let's rise in body or spirit for our closing song.